Welcome back to the Big Picture Bible. In this third module, we're going to be looking at the kingdom era of the Old Testament. Last time we focused on the Exodus and Israel's wilderness wanderings. Then we looked at tribal Israel as they invaded and settled the land of promise, the land of Canaan. They went on to live as a loosely organized nation under the judges for around 350 years with lots of ups and downs due to their unfaithfulness to the covenant. In this session, we're going to explore the time when Israel began to yearn for a larger status as a people. In the process of becoming more politically united, they expressed a rejection of God by calling for a human king to lead them. So, having been liberated from slavery and settled in the land of promise for several centuries, Israel had not been able to unite fully into a cohesive nation. The tribes were often in competition and even outright warfare with one another. And because of this lack of unity, Israel did not fulfill its role as a light to the nations around them. In this session, we're going to move the biblical account into the next level as Israel became a kingdom, and when the kings were godly, they began to fulfill their mission to become a light to the nations, to the Gentiles. The events of the kingdom era are recorded in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which speak of Israel's first two kings, Saul and David, the books of Kings, which record the later kings ruling over the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and the books of Chronicles, which provide a parallel history of Samuel and Kings, but they do it from a mostly Judean and priestly perspective. The United Kingdom of Israel began somewhere around 1050 BC until around 930 BC. Again, these dates are approximate. In the following periods, we'll be able to pinpoint dates just a bit more precisely. In this course, we may give dates such as circa something. This Latin word circa means around, and we get our word circle or circus from it. So, for example, circa 1050 means around 1050 BC. Around that time, Israel began to desire a major change in its leadership. This desire came about because of several issues. Well, first of all, because of the instability of the previous more than 300 years under the judges. They craved the stability that a king could provide. And this instability had prompted some tribes to begin to go their own way. There's some evidence that elements of the coastal tribes like Asher and Dan had business of their own and were lumped in with the other peoples in a trade network that spanned the Mediterranean world and even went as far as Britain. History labels these traders as Phoenicians, but the name Phoenician was just a label used by their Greek trading partners that meant the people who traded in the expensive and sought-after purple dye made from the secretions of mollusks, which are snail-like creatures that lived in the eastern Mediterranean. The traders came from several different groups of people, including Israelites and the Canaanites, who lived along the Mediterranean coast in places like Tyre and Sidon. The eastern tribes like Reuben, Gad, and part of Manasseh, who lived east of the Jordan River, seem to have grown detached toward what was happening with their sister tribes west of the river. And often they did their own thing. In fact, the entire body of northern tribes always seemed to have had a bit of a standoffish attitude toward the southern tribes, and especially the tribe of Judah. Then, just in practical terms, most of the judges were simply not able to lead all of the tribes. Some proved themselves to be untrustworthy. Some of the later judges were especially corrupt, as in the case of the sons of Eli, who were openly dishonest, abusive, and manipulative, as well as just being generally ungodly. In any case, there was a growing desire among the tribes to be like other nations whose power and prestige was shown in royal courts, central governments, and armies. The years leading up to the establishment of Israel's monarchy in the middle of the 11th century were presided over by a key person, and this person's name was Samuel. It's no exaggeration to say that Samuel was absolutely essential to the future of Israel. It would be impossible to envision Israel becoming what it did without him. And I think we could safely say that Samuel was to his generation as Moses was to his generation, or as Joseph was to his generation. Each of these men served as the leader that God used to bring Israel to the level from which they could fulfill their calling in their own times. Now, Samuel served three pivotal roles in Israel's life. First, he was the last of the judges. Eli was both a high priest and a judge. He was a good man, but a weak father, and his sons were a disaster. They robbed and abused the people. Samuel succeeded Eli, but Samuel's sons were not much better. The people had had enough by that time of corrupt judges, and they were not going any further down that road. Second, Samuel was the first in the line of national prophets. This prophetic line extended through people like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Elijah, Habakkuk, and Malachi. It extended right down to the time of John the Baptist, who was the last to pick up that prophetic role before the coming of the Messiah. Third, Samuel was the maker of Israel's monarchy, its kings. He anointed its first two kings, Saul and David, and Saul's line did not continue, but David's line endured officially for around 400 years and then unofficially after the remnant of Israel became subject to other nations. The line of David persisted until the time of the Messiah, Jesus, a descendant of David, who brought the fullness of God's kingdom on earth. Well, in his old age, Samuel saw Israel reject his sons as judges and demand a human king. Samuel was shocked and angered by this demand. He prayed to the Lord, seeing their demand as a rejection of himself and of God. But God directed him to grant their request. However, he was told to warn them that any form of leadership can be corrupted. Kings can also be corrupt, in fact, on an even larger scale. Yet somehow this demand for a king was within the will of God, because at the end of the book of Genesis, the prophecy concerning the tribe of Judah was that it would hold the scepter over Israel. It may be that God's plan was to use this unification under kings to enable Israel to make a greater impact than they could as a group of 12 separate and independent-minded tribes. The first king, chosen by Lot, and reflecting the shallow nature of the people, was Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. He reigned from around 1050 to around 1010 BC. Now remember, these dates are approximate. Saul was the son of Kish, a notable man from the tribe of Benjamin, who lived in the territory just north of the city of Jerusalem. Initially, Saul rallied Israel against their Philistine oppressors, but he did not have the faith to break their dominance. As a side note, maybe you've heard of periods in ancient history like the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. Well, the reigns of Saul and David occurred just at the break between those two ages. The Philistines dominated Israel partly because they had gained a local monopoly on iron technology. Iron implements and weapons are harder and more durable than bronze items. And the Philistines forced Israel to use the old bronze technology, which put them at a serious disadvantage. In fact, they had to go to the Philistines to have whatever iron they did possess sharpened by them. 1 Samuel 13:20 describes how Israel was forced to buy and repair iron implements from their Philistine oppressors. It says, "So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened." Although he was handsome and tall, Saul had serious defects. Saul's deepest defect was that he could not trust God in a crisis. The early years of his reign showed many examples of this bad personality trait. And the last straw of Saul's unbelief happened when Israel was on the verge of annihilation by the Philistines. You may remember that because Samuel was born into a priestly family, he could make sacrifices to intercede for Israel. But at this critical time when the Philistines were ready to attack, Samuel just was not available to make a sacrifice. So Saul himself took matters into his own hands and made the sacrifice, which was strictly forbidden to anyone but a priest. As a result, God determined to take the kingdom away from Saul and give it to someone else. Up through chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, Saul continually revealed his stubborn and faithless heart. Although Saul continued to rule as king for a number of years, the rise of David began from the time of that incident. Now, the dynasty of David stems from the tribe of Judah, which Jacob prophesied would hold the scepter or kingship at the end of Genesis. David reigned from around 1010 to approximately 970 BC. In chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, Samuel privately went to the city of Bethlehem and anointed as Saul's successor a teenager named David, who was the youngest son of a respected man named Jesse. Soon after, David entered Saul's service as a companion and musician, as well as a close friend of Saul's son Jonathan. Saul apparently had heard of David's musical ability and developed a deep affection for David soon after he entered his service. But Saul became jealous of David when he did what no other Israelite dared to do in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and that is kill the Philistine giant Goliath. The battle at the Valley of Elah temporarily broke the Philistine dominance over Israel and bought Saul some time to rally his forces. Well, the people of Israel instantly made David a national hero. But in his jealousy, Saul plotted to get rid of David by sending him out on raids against the Philistines, hoping that maybe he'd be killed in the process. David's success, though, in these raids only increased his status and fame even more. But Saul's jealousy only deepened. And so Saul attempted to kill David, who then fled with a few trusted men to hide out in the desert. On several occasions, David's life was in jeopardy, and twice David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but he refused to do so because he was God's anointed. Instead, David trusted in God to deliver and exalt him. Eventually, Saul went into battle against the Philistines at Beth-shan, which is at the east end of the Jezreel Valley near the Jordan River. The Philistines were a coastal people, remember. Beth-shan is near the south end of the Sea of Galilee. So what the Philistines were attempting to do was to complete their domination of Israel by encircling their territory. Saul and his son Jonathan died near Beth-shan on Mount Gilboa, leaving David free to pursue the throne for himself. David was not only a warrior of great military skill and a great leader of men, he also had a very tender heart toward God. His time of testing when he was being pursued by Saul and often near death had taught him to trust God in difficult circumstances, unlike Saul. David was crowned king, first over his own tribe Judah, and later over all Israel. And once he was crowned king, David conquered many of the surrounding lands, the Philistine territory to the southwest, Moab and Ammon to the southeast, and Edom to the south. He made alliances with the cities of Tyre and Sidon to the north. And on the whole, David's reign was just and prosperous, given the times. He even desired to build a temple for God to replace the tabernacle at Shiloh that the Philistines had desecrated and burned decades before. But God forbade him. He had too much blood on his hands, too much bloodshed during his reign. But though he was a great man, David had some serious flaws as well, as most of us do. First, he got overconfident with his successes and took God's blessing for granted. And while his armies were off fighting the Ammonites, David stayed home. And that was the opening for another flaw, David's eye for women. At home in the palace, he fell into sin with Bathsheba, the beautiful wife of Uriah, one of his bodyguards, who was away with the army. Now, whether the affair was a mutual thing or just David's aggression is hard to say. In any case, after a short time, Bathsheba became pregnant. David had to think fast, of course. His idea was to send for Bathsheba's husband to come home for a brief time. And that way, the child could appear to be his. But the plan did not work because even though Uriah did return to the palace, he refused to go home and relax. Ultimately, David made the decision to send Uriah back to the army and arrange for him to die in battle. And this freed David to take Bathsheba for himself. But if David thought that he'd gotten away with his sin, he was dead wrong. Nathan the prophet confronted him with what he had done, and he predicted that his sin would bring trouble to David's own family and to the kingdom as a whole. 2 Samuel 15 begins the sad chain of events that caused great harm to the kingdom and grief to David and his entire family. David's own son, Absalom, murdered his brother and attempted to take his father's throne away from him. There was civil war as a result, and though David was victorious, Absalom, his son, was killed, and David sank into deep grief. From that time on, he lacked the faith and confidence of his early years, and these events set the stage for disunity among the tribes of Israel. Now, Solomon's birth is recorded in 2 Samuel 12. David had quickly taken Bathsheba as one of his wives. But Solomon was not the child of the affair between Bathsheba and David. Unfortunately, that child died. It was sometime later that Solomon was born to Bathsheba and grew up in the royal court amid the strife of David's family. Bathsheba seems to have convinced David at some point that of all of his sons by other wives, her boy Solomon should be the next king. When David died then, Solomon was indeed proclaimed king. And as king, Solomon quickly put down a plot of one of his older brothers to seize Israel's throne for himself. Solomon's reign over Israel is remembered as one of economic prosperity, great wisdom, cultural achievements, and an expanding empire. At the beginning of his reign, God promised to grant Solomon any deepest desire that he may have. And Solomon revealed the sincerity of his heart by asking God for wisdom to govern Israel properly. And that desire was granted. Solomon was a great maker of alliances, a great patron of Israelite exploration, and the architect of Israel's domination over many surrounding lands. This map will give you an idea of the extent of Solomon's vast empire, which included the territory of all the tribes, as well as lands far beyond. On this map you can see a number of friendly nations as well. Egypt to the southwest, the cities of Tyre and Sidon in the north. Also, who could forget the state visit of the Queen of Sheba from the far south? Nations subject to Israel included Moab, Ammon, and Edom. So for close to 100 years in the 1000s and 900s BC, Israel ruled over an extensive empire. In 1 Kings chapter 6, we read how in the 4th year of his reign, Solomon began the construction of the permanent temple that his father David had wanted to build but was told he could not. Remember that Israel had used a movable tent-like structure called the tabernacle, which was located at Shiloh until the Philistines destroyed it sometime around 1100 BC. And when it was finished, the temple was a magnificent structure of white limestone adorned with gold and other precious jewels and metals. It was counted as one of the wonders of the ancient world. During Solomon's 40-year reign, he proved to be not only a wise and just king, but also a shrewd diplomat, scientist, writer, philosopher, and more. He collected, wrote, or edited much of the book of Proverbs. He may have composed the book called Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs. This composition on love, sex, and marriage probably features Solomon as the main character. It actually may be the very first opera ever written. There's also a lot of evidence to suggest that Solomon wrote the great philosophical work on the meaning of life called Ecclesiastes. The last years of Solomon's reign, however, were marked by compromise. His success and wealth had tempted him to relax his devotion to God. The many wives that he married from foreign nations lured him into idolatry and turned his heart away from full devotion to the Lord. Solomon died after ruling 40 years, leaving his son Rehoboam on the throne. With the death of Solomon, the United Kingdom period ends.